How you going, dude?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
All right. How
Uh,
you doing?
Good. Yourself?
Good.
Excellent. Well, kick us off with why you believe. Man, this topic is long. Hey.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to put some of the definitions in there. So
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I prepared a little opening statement, so I'm going to start off with that.
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay, so the topic, like I just said, I wanted to lay out specific definitions, especially for something like this. I think this is something that really needs to start off with some definitions.
I agree. I agree.
So essentially, starting off using the definitions where objective means not influenced by personal feelings, and morality means principles concerning the distinction between right, wrong, or good and bad behavior. I believe the word objective morality. Um, sorry, I just
That's right.
right, wrong, good and bad. Do these distinctions really exist in an objective sense? Can what is right or wrong, or good or bad, be distinguished scientifically in any repeatable way? Is there a consistent standard of good? If so, does the standard apply universally, including all living things? Is it restrictive, limiting only certain species to the quality of life distinction and well-being requirement? All life requires the destruction of others to survive and continue. Every creature born into the community dies for the community and gives to the community through death. Nothing is untouched or special or independent from this. If a gazelle is being chased by a lion, is there a true and consistent distinction of objectivity in the well-being of both the lion and the gazelle, with the result of either an escape or capture? With escape, the well-being of the lion is sacrificed at the cost of maintaining the well-being of the lion. With the capture, excuse me, with the capture, the well-being of the gazelle is sacrificed at the cost and maintaining the well-being of the lion. I believe that right and wrong are concepts which require a mind and personal interpretations. And this is essentially where I kind of get my biggest disagreement that objective morality can, or at least that morality can be objective, because I believe morality essentially focuses on the distinction between what is right and what is wrong, and essentially creates principles to follow that. And I just don't see how we can ever even talk about the concept of right or wrong without having personal feelings. I'm certainly open to learning a lot about this topic, and that's the main reason I wanted to bring up as a discussion. So I'm hoping I can learn more, and I like the idea of of objective morality. So I'm hoping I can you can essentially teach me a lot about it. So with that, I'm just going to pass the mic to you and get this discussion started.
Absolutely. So I think your definition's largely spot on. There's one thing I'll take issue with. At one point, you mentioned an idea of it being able to be tested scientifically. So I don't know if you're familiar with the idea that you cannot derive an ought from an is. I'm a big fan of that, which is basically to say that the sort of scientific truth you're talking about, like the truth which describes physical phenomenon within the universe, you can't derive morality from that. So you can't test morality in the scientific realm. So does that kind of make sense, right? So we could come up with a moral set of behavior that could be untestable scientifically, as in you couldn't create those conditions in a lab and expect some sort of material result out of it, for example. But you definitely could, for example, set up a set of criteria for which morality is what works or doesn't work, and then you could, I guess, just see if anything fails the test there. But that's not a scientific test, if that makes sense. Would you agree with at least that? Or?
Yeah, I just definitely understand what you're saying. I mean, I've spent some time looking into the basics of the ought versus is. There are certain levels I don't understand about it. I'll try to give you what I basically understand. If you kind of have some issue with that, kind of maybe just let me know. But I mean, it makes perfect sense from my limited understanding that essentially, I'll try to break it down as simple as I can in what I think about it. When you say something ought to be a certain way or something essentially should be a certain way, you can't really derive actual, what's the term? You can't kind of create. That's one of the most difficult things about something like that. Right off the bat, I have a difficult time kind of expressing what that actually means. that's one thing I wouldn't just mind discussing more, because
Mm.
you would say obviously you can't derive any from any is, or there's no position in logical reasoning where you could ever essentially do that. It's always essentially it's going to be a fallacious claim. Essentially, it's never going to be. Okay. And that's regardless, obviously, whether something is objective or subjective.
Oh, hang on. No, so that's wrong. So with you can have objective claims about the material world, right? Like
Right.
the properties of dead matter, like sand or whatever, right? Like we can know objectively these are what these properties are. All I'm claiming with this minor definitional dispute is that the method of scientific testing, like to use language precisely, is to in a controlled environment make predictions, test those predictions against a controlled experiment, and see if the outcome is what you would expect, which works for dead matter, because like you can make predictions about the material properties about dead matter, test if those properties give you the results you expect, and then draw conclusions. What I'm saying is that sort of test, that controlled environment about the properties of dead matter, is an entirely different form of objective to morality. Like that is a truth claim which is about the innate properties of dead matter. That is not the sort of truth claim which can be said about morality. So the scientific testing of one does not does not transpose well onto the scientific testing of another, because there's no way for you to set up like a lab controlled environment by which you can test right or wrong, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. The most common thing I tend to hear about objective morality from a lot of people, especially people who share, let's say like the lack of belief in a God, like me as an atheist. I hear the term well-being being brought up a lot, and it's essentially the claim that an objective standard can be made, supporting or at least see, this is essentially what I have a problem with, because I think it's trying to derive a not from from it is like,
right.
It's the whole concept of well-being can be a standard by which we can determine right and wrong. I guess that's kind of what I have the main issue with.
Right.
And the main reason for that is because I believe the objective itself kind of, once you have any kind of personal feelings involved, there becomes an issue. And I do want to say that I probably have not, I don't know if it's a misunderstanding of the word objective, or maybe it's a equivocation fallacy issue, where sometimes I think I may be talking about two different objectivities.
Everyone does. So one of the common mistakes is that the way people use the word objective in common parlance is the idea that something is true regardless of what anyone else feels about it. There's no opinion, which is I like the definition which you put up. But another one would be that is the truth of objects, if that kind of makes sense. So that objective just means what is true about dead matter, regardless of whether it's we're just composed of dead matter. Like so. I guess what may be a good way to kick this off. Obviously, there's not 100% uncontroversial agreement about the scientific testing point, but I'll give you my standard for objective morality, and you can poke some holes in it and see what you reckon. So, my claim about objective morality is that it is what is good for the survival of you, your family, your community, and your environment now, today, tomorrow, next week, onwards. So, and a lot of the things you talked about well-being. I just think that well-being is a natural consequence of survival, because I think if you set up a scenario where we all survive but we're all miserable, I don't think that's realistic. I think that being like a set of a community which is totally miserable all of the time is one which is not likely to survive for very long. That game is likely to collapse in and itself. So my claim is not well-being first, therefore morality, which I can imagine it's very easy to take issue with, because you go, well, what's the definition of well-being? But mine is just, it's survival. And the sort of stuff which we like to think this would be nice or this would be well-being is just an inevitable consequence of survival. And then actions which further that goal are objectively moral, and actions which don't are not moral enough. And the difficulty here is, and this is where I think a lot of the definitions, where it's very difficult to come up with the idea of an objective morality, is that there are some actions for which this is very, very easy So if I was to ask you, for example, would it be moral to just shoot everyone, right? Then we'd probably, for no reason whatsoever, then we'd probably agree, no, that's not the right thing to do. And that's because it's very easy to see how it qualifies as being good for you, good for them, good for society. But if there's some greater overriding purpose, right? So what if we're shooting everyone who is about to commit a genocide on someone else, where that question gets blurry? Well, then it's hard to tell. For example, it might be good for you and it might not be good for them, but it was certainly good for another group of people further down the timescale line, if that makes sense. So as in what's bad for you today might be good for the society tomorrow, and thus it can justify its morality. Now, I agree those questions are hard, but just like if you have a really hard maths problem, that doesn't mean that there's not truth at the end of it, if that makes sense. So I've lost your picture. Are you still there?
Yeah, I've lost yours, but I can hear you still.
So just because a question is difficult to adjudicate, and I admit we will really only know in hindsight, right? Like we could do something which seems moral, but is like it seems moral now, but we turned it up, we got it totally wrong, for example, right? Like, and I think climate change might be a good example of this if you believe in that. Like, regardless of what you believe about climate change, if climate change is real, the idea that industrialization was good for everyone's well-being now, but ultimately killed us all, would mean that in hindsight that would be like an immoral action, or that or it wasn't moral enough, that maybe we should have done it in a different way. That would be my standard for objective morality. And I get that it's difficult for the tough questions, but I think it's very easy for the easy questions. And so that's my standard. Go ahead and see if you've poked some holes in it, because that's how you get a better definition, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess when I think of objectivity, I think of mostly basic scientific experiment where you could have a set of standards and tests I could run, anybody could run. It's going to have the same results, where essentially your results and the most typically the result. I mean, there could be human error, but the idea is that the results are going to be the same. Anybody's going to be able to do the same experiment, come to the same result, because because I guess objective reality would be the reason for that. But that's what, to me, what makes kind of science objective. And that's what I think about. I think about, is there any kind of test? Is there any way we could have some kind of test to give to really anybody, whether it's John or Khabib from somewhere else, and apply that where everyone's going to come with the same answer. I mean, in a sense, they're going to be able to know that this is moral or this is immoral.
I could
kind of like what you're talking about.
I could answer this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, are you familiar with one of those crackpot climate engineering ideas that if we explode a couple of volcanoes, we'll fill the cloud of ash and it'll reflect a lot of sunlight? Have you heard of that? Yeah. So for example, that is untestable, right? Like because the atmosphere is so complex, we can never set it up in a lab and get accurate results. But in theory, for example, if we had, just like the Earth shrunk down into a box and we applied it, we could see how it goes. So the standard for scientific tests isn't what you can test in the lab with your current restrictions. The question is, with the most advanced technology in the world, could you in theory test this? So what I would say is that if we wanted to test the morality of of a certain action, so let's say intervening with genocides, right? Is that moral? If we had the same technology we'd use for the volcano experiment, where we shrunk down the Earth, and we got a ton of different Earths controlling for all different factors, and we just had some of them prevent genocides and some of them not prevent genocides, and there was statistical significant data which suggested that all of the ones which prevented genocides lived, like the species lived on, and all the ones which didn't collapsed in on themselves, and civil war and everyone ended up killing themselves, and we end up with nuclear wasteland, then that would be, for example, that would be objective test in my mind. Because in theory, if we transcended our technological limitations on testing, we could come up with did the species survive or not, and how many of them survived. What was it, just them, or was it their family, their society, and did they survive now, tomorrow, next week, blah 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 blah. Does that kind of satisfy that?
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying completely. It maybe just come down to the slight misunderstanding on my part too, I think. But because I totally understand, the concepts of right and wrong, and how they're applied seemingly universally. Which I mean, I think that's kind of where the concept of objective really comes from. But like almost like the example you gave. Like, let's say you have, you talked earlier about shooting everyone or something like that. Let's say you have, one person or who decides that, human beings have been such a great disaster to this world through, like you say, maybe things they've affected the climate and stuff like that. That killing off every human being at this point may be a good thing, regardless of everyone else's opinion on that. They may, or beliefs or thoughts on that. They may think that is true and right and good. And my question, I guess, would be is how do we, who have people who have things to lose essentially from a decision like that, how do we go about convincing that person of this objective standard for them to see our point of view?
Well, I think that the sorts of people who say that the human beings need to be wiped off the earth because we're a plague on the environment, I don't think they actually believe that. It's the same way in which, when people say, let's kill all white people, but they themselves, are like intermingle. They would never do that. I'm kind of like believe how people act, not what they say. And so the reason I would say that fails the standard is because it doesn't actually lead to the survival of the species. And I get it that sometimes the survival of some species comes at the expense of survival of others, but that just shows that they're not true enough. Like, as in, they're not moral enough. You can have, gradations, right? It's the same way in which, like gravity, right? How gravity works in kind of small, like the theory of gravity works for localized experiments where it's the idea that mass attracts each other, and we've got an equation which outlines it. But the moment you make it really, 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 really big, there are some instances where the equation starts to fail or starts to produce increasing amounts of error. So that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that gravity's like basically useless, right? That just means it's the best we've got right now. And I think the way human beings are surviving right now at the expense of some other species is the best we've got right now. It would be better than if we were totally gone, but it's not as good as if we were to be, here and some of those other species were to survive. As in, it was good for us and the society and also the environment, as opposed to now we're only kind of qualifying the first two levels, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I think because I have a hard time seeing because I think I don't know if it's the way I just see objective, but when I think of objective, like I said, in the scientific sense, I don't know how I can apply that to that because, just even if there's someone who completely disagrees with you, even if they're going to be hard-headed about it and look at all the evidence and tell you you're wrong, even in the end, they can at least run certain experiments and experience essentially the facts or truth of whatever the test is supposed to show. Yeah. Even if
the volcanoes thing, right? Like, do you think that there is no scientific way to test if volcanoes could stop climate change by spewing the ash into the air? Like, would that be something you think has an objective truth at the end of it?
See, I think that's a really great question because that's kind of touching on what I'm talking about because it really is, without the experiment and no way to really test it, that's kind of what I'm talking about. But it technically just should be objectively true, regardless, right. Obviously, because
so the large hadron collider, right? Like the idea that when you move things there, so it would be weird if our standard for objective truth about that theory was there was no way it could be objectively true, and then we built the hadron collider, and then it could be objectively true. Like that would be weird. It's not a question of is it testable now? Is it testable in theory, right? If we transcended all the technological limitations. And what I'm saying is that if you start the standard as being survival for you, family, society, environment, and you could get bigger than that, I suppose, if we discovered some other dimension now, today, tomorrow, next week, forever. If you could make a whole lot of mini globes or mini universes and put them on fast forward and control for all the other variables and show statistically significant evidence that one set of decision making tends to lead to the most survival for the greatest amount of time, then that would be the most moral thing. And that would be what you would call an objective test. The same way in which if you could make all the mini globes and explode the volcanoes and see if it worked out, right? So that would also be an objective test, even though our current technological limitations don't allow us now.
Right. So my problem might be actually the way I apply almost like a kind of a strict standard to the word objective, where, like, for example, obviously no matter what we do and anytime we're going to discuss something or think about something, it's going to require personal feelings. So even when we talk about objectivity and something that isn't affected by the way we think about it, essentially like the results we're going to get, it's still, there's a subjectivity to objectivity. Essentially there's always going to be a subjective viewpoint of objectivity or of the objective reality. And that's kind of where I'm almost like, it's almost like I'm kind of thinking it's not objectivity just because we have to have a subjective viewpoint of the objective reality. If that makes sense.
I don't think that objectivity will always be subjective. I think one of the reasons it feels like that sometimes is that people tend to use it as like a political bludgeon of, you know, kind of in like, my opinion is better than your opinion because mine's objective and yours is based on feelings. And that really muddies the waters as to what that word means, and it kind of pollutes the way people understand it. So I understand. So I think that's where a lot of people get that idea of, it's always some amount of feelings involved, because they've heard the word used in the political realm too much, where it is not objective as to, you know, which policies will work sometimes. Whereas I think we can agree, and I think you're right, that when you were talking earlier about how objectivity is about scientific testing. But what I'm saying is that it's not about whether you can scientifically test things now. It's about whether, in theory, you could set up the created circumstances where we could scientifically test it. And I think the difficulty comes when we're testing science for the truth of objects, right, for the materials of dead matter, that there's no presupposed criteria as to what we're testing for. Like, we've obviously come up with linguistic categories to things, like testing materials for, say, malleability or tensile strength. And we are testing for those properties. But there hasn't really been a very commonly articulated language for what the properties of morality is. And that's what I'm trying to do in this debate here. I think the linguistic categories for the property of morality are that good for, and then if you can expand the concentric circles away from you to family, society, environment, and then you build that upwards as to now, today, tomorrow, next week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once those linguistic, and then the hardest part of my claim, I guess, is the idea of, because a lot of people would say, well, what about, you know, if we all lived in a prison planet where we all tortured ourselves, you know, over and over and over again, that would be survival, but it wouldn't be good morally. And the more difficult part of my claim is just to say that there's no way in which that could sustain itself. Like, that would collapse instantly. So that's that I think is the hardest part of my claim, to be honest. Like, because I think everyone can accept that survival is a good enough standard, but come up with a few thought experiments where survival might not lead to well-being. And my claim is basically that that's impossible, which obviously is a big claim. But does that kind of make sense with the why objective it gets muddled? Sort of.
Yeah, I think so. We actually were just saying too. I actually have a few things to say about that. Sorry, the last thing you actually just said. With objective morality, I'm not sure exactly how to fully approach that, but kind of lost the point I was just gonna make.
You know, I've actually got a good counter experiment for you for non-objective morality, because I think where non-objective morality leads you, if it is just a matter of opinion, is that you have to then accept that there is an opinion which would make certain actions moral, which I think all of us would have a lot of trouble rationalizing. So here's a few of them. Like Auschwitz, right? Do you think that there's a world in which that could be seen to be as moral as charity?
I would have to say as moral,
because if it's just a matter of feelings, right? Then you could say, well, one person really feels strongly that, you know, targeted genocide is moral, and who's to say that their feelings are any less strong than the guy who thinks charity is moral?
Right. I almost think in the sense of what morality is in the kind of definition we're using, if someone makes the distinction that it is right or more right to kill and harm lots of people than it is to give charity and help people, I wouldn't agree with that morality, but I don't. That's part of the issue I would have, is because essentially the definition of morality, in my opinion, kind of gives them that freedom to create that. I would think they're wrong. I certainly wouldn't want to live in a world like that where tons of people are thinking that way. But I guess that maybe that is probably a good place to focus on, because I guess when I think about that, I think that I don't see how that wouldn't be moral if that's what if they make that distinction, that is, the distinction between right and wrong, and create principles around it, regardless of what the distinction is. I think it's still essentially morality, right? It's
right.
Just, it would be their idea of morality.
So I would disagree. I just don't think there's any world in which you could say that's moral. So here are a few other ones. For example, what about like child rape? Is there a like, could you construct a thing where you just be like, well, look, if someone thinks that's moral, then it's moral to them, like.
Well, I think that's the issue, though, because the definition of morality is like that we're using here. The principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, good or bad behavior. There, like I was saying, there really is no objective test to show that something is right or wrong. I don't believe there is, at least at this point. So that would, I think that causes that problem where someone can essentially, it's my morality. You're going to tell me I'm not moral, but it's how are you going to convince me that I'm not moral? How are you going to?
Okay, so what I think there is that if we live in a culture where people think that things need to be scientifically tested, then that's a big problem. Because, for example, before we could test whether gravity was real, right? Before we had the equations and we could do the lab experiment, would you encourage people to jump off bridges? No one was doing that, right?
I would see what I would say right off the bat with that is me walking and doing things every day is testing. Is essentially scientifically tested.
That's not scientific.
Gravity.
Absolutely not.
Right. That's right. It's maybe not scientifically, but it certainly is. It is a test that gives me experience to work on and things like that. Right.
Yeah. So you can live your life and know things are true in an imprecise way you can't quite scientifically articulate yet, but you know they're true. What I would say is the way you are living your life, and you know that raping children is not a good thing, or that genocide against groups is not a good thing. You can't quite articulate the scientific reason for yet, because we don't have the technology to make all the globes and see if everyone was doing this, would it be good? That doesn't mean there's not an answer at the end. So, one thing actually I'd say here, because you've got atheist in a name, are you a fan of Sam Harris at all?
Yeah. Sam Harris, yeah. That's actually Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty is where I heard a lot of the objective morality claims. It's kind of where I've been.
So one argument I think of his, which is really, really good, is, have you ever heard his low-hanging fruit argument?
I'm not sure.
So one of it's in a Q&A once where he basically gets asked. He's talking about objective morality, and he says, "Is it moral to throw acid in someone else's face?" And a lot of people, similar to the Auschwitz child example, go like, "No, that's awful." And then one person asks him, "Well, that's the easy example, Like, why don't you deal with the questions we're actually trying to deal with, the hard ones about, is it?" And we were talking about earlier about hard things like self-defense and sacrifice. And Sam's response, I think, which solves this very, very well, is to prove that there is an objective morality. The burden there is not to show if every action is moral or immoral. It's just to prove that in theory there is gradations of morality. And if we can all agree on one easy example, that something is more moral and something is immoral, then we've already created some standard, right? We've created some vision or some gradation between morality and immorality. And once we know the easy questions, right, we've already created a standard by which we're saying things are objectively moral or immoral. The hard bit then is applying that standard to the more tough questions. But not knowing the answers to those tough questions does not mean that there is no such thing as objective morality. And the analogy here to science would be, right, we don't know all scientific truths. That doesn't mean that there is no such thing as scientific truth. It just means that we don't know it yet. And that's right. That, I guess, is the way you could resolve that from the Newtonian scientific worldview.
Okay. I just there's some issues I think I can almost essentially say it feels like it's an objective truth, or there's almost very few people who are going to disagree in the first place. Yeah, let alone there's plenty of, like you're saying, survival reason why. Like, obviously, random acts of killing usually aren't ever going to be considered moral by almost anybody, because they usually don't even benefit anybody, and they tend to just add harm. But kind of like the example I was talking about earlier, when you have like a gazelle and a lion and stuff. One question I would have is, is something either essentially moral or not moral? Can, like, for example, the two situations with obviously what I'm trying to say here is, if you have the gazelle essentially or the lion chasing a gazelle and it eats the gazelle, versus whether the gazelle gets away, two situations. Can both of those be moral? Would one of those need to be immoral? I mean, that would probably be false dichotomy.
Well, so what I think here is, so what we're talking about is hunting in principle. So what I think is this: in a local level. So imagine the concentric circles. In a local level, it's good for the lion, so it's moral at that level. But that it doesn't show whether it's objective or not. So we expand it out. Is it good for the lion and the lion's family? Yes. Is it good for the lion and the lion's society? Yes. Is it good for the environment? And then you could say, aha, well, it's not good on a local. That we'll leave that question mark on that for the moment. Then you look at it from the gazelle's point of view. Is it good for them? No. If it's good, is it good for them, their family? No. So then the question there is that, well, we're looking at the wrong resolution. So you can't look at it for what's good for the individual actors. You have to look at the environmental circle. And the answer there would be, if it's possible, like if all lions would die, if some gazelles didn't die, right? Like if the ceasing of hunting of gazelles dying meant that there were no more lions anymore, that is not good for the environment at large. And that will have spill-on effects to the collapsing of the circle for other species if all the lions go away, right? Because then their prey, pollute the world too much, and then the gazelles' population grows and they start to make extinct other species. So that is not to cease hunting gazelles would not be a moral action, because even though it's moral locally for the gazelle, it's immoral in a macro sense for everyone else. But I get why that's confusing, right? Because it's still moral locally, which is why you need to question the greater impact of everyone's actions. Whereas if, for example, there was a world where the lions ceased eating the gazelles and the gazelles lived, and there wasn't catastrophic effects, and the lions still lived, and there wasn't catastrophic effects on the environment, then that might be the moral thing to do. And I think a good analogy here would be, for example, vegetarianism. Before we have the technology to live sustainably off just vegetables, right? It would be a disaster if we were all vegetarian, because the species would probably die out, and we wouldn't be able to, help and do good things. But once we, for example, get artificial meat, like, how they're making the meat patties out of like stem cells. I think once we get that, like once there is meat nutritionally identical created, I think the case for eating animals gets way, 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 way less moral, right? Because now there is an option by which you can sustain yourself completely equally, have no disadvantages to you or your environment or anything, except that now you're not killing as many animals. Then yeah, I think then the morality bar shifts, because you've got more options. Does that kind of answer the gazelle point?
I think it does. Though the one thing I would say is, like you're saying, the localized level, and when you look at a bigger level, there's obviously certain factors that maybe don't come in at the small level, and I definitely agree with that. But I think about, for example, as humans, I think we dabble in the more greater perspective, or the effect of that things have on the world essentially is greater with what we can do than what, for example, lion and gazelle. Most of their actions, and I mean, I'm not going to even guess this to say I know how they think or what they really feel, but if we're even like humans in a more tribal aspect, you're going to probably still think about a greater kind of more than just your local level, even if you're not as involved as we are, especially a lot of cultures kind of really have like a spiritual or kind of religious overtone where they they value the whole as well, So that's very common. But what I do wonder though is how, because I personally think there may actually be some kind of objectivity like that, but how, I guess my main issue is how is that expressed to people? How do we, and I guess that's my biggest question is how do we convince them? How do we help? How do we use the idea of morality and what we can, if it's objective, how do we teach that to, maybe like I was saying, prevent someone from making very unmoral decisions?
So here's how I reckon we've been doing that all the time already. Human beings, well before science was discovered, was trying to figure out this question, and they were telling it in stories. And many of, how like there's always the idea of like the moral of the story, and you get all these religious stories, which no matter what the religion, they all seem to kind of say the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, the person sacrifices themselves and that was good for everyone else. Like these are like really, really, really rough articulations of moral truths, right? The idea that maybe the individual is not as important as everyone else around them. And then you get Disney stories, which, like Hamlet is roughly the same as the Lion King, which is roughly the same as the, Mesopotamian creation myth. So the way we've been teaching it so far is stories. We've been telling like archetypal stories and lots of Disney movies. And this is where a lot of, you're an atheist, right? You probably noticed yourself. It's like, how is it that all these religious people think that their story is the special one? It's when it's the same as all of the other ones with a few minor character changes. Well, the reason why it's special is because everyone's been trying to answer the same question. What on earth are we doing here? And what is the right way to behave? Right? And they're all kind of coming up with roughly the same answer, right? And the way they communicate it to their societies is by constructing these stories, by kind of saying, right, and look what happens to the people who behave like this, and look what happens to people who behave like that. And that's the way they've been trying to teach it so far. I don't know if it's a great method, to be honest. I mean, it's done us all right because we've come to a point where we're able to coexist in an incredibly complicated society. Like the fact that, like you sound like you're American, that we can talk from other sides of the world and we're not tearing each other apart, and we're engaging in like some sort of like this conversation. We have agreed that there is some sort of common purpose between us. The fact that, despite the fact that we will never see each other in our entire lives, like that's a miracle of sorts. Like that shows that the way in which human beings have been constructing things so far, it's doing okay. And I think maybe modern philosophers will say, well, we need to be more academic and we need to do it in the universities, and that might work as well. Or maybe we need both. It's hard to tell what the best way is, but that's how we've been doing it so far.
Right. And I think kind of to sum it up right now, we got about 7.5 minutes left, but I think I agree with almost most of everything you said about morality. Especially, I kind of like to focus on like the survival and, like you're saying, kind of keep bringing it out, and that I think it's really good. And I guess maybe the main problem I have is the fact that there are going to be people, even if they do a scientific experiment, they're going to say no, that kind of concept. And I guess maybe that's my biggest problem is because you can't stop that regardless. There are going to be people who, no matter how objectively you show something or how true something actually is, I can just be an ass and say nope, whatever. So I guess maybe that's my main problem is because I'm looking for a standard that technically isn't even there in science either, though. I'm looking for too much on that level, because that's a problem. I think it's easier to say, okay, well, look at this. Here's this test we can do right now. Gravity. I'm going to push you over. You're going to fall. Stuff like that. It's harder for someone to be as dismissive and just say, I don't care. I'm not going to believe that. Then with feelings, and especially with like emotionally charged, maybe political beliefs, angry people get violent sometimes, something like that. I guess people are going to be more out to ignore those truths if they can find them as truths. I think everyone can agree that there's, at least that I'm aware who thinks and processes information, can agree that there's got to be some actions that increase your rate of survival or maybe potentially diminish your rate of survival. Yeah. I mean, the reason we make basic decisions and that's, I think, one of the greatest things on a personal level is our pain, but we can't use that pain, that physical pain, to bring it out further. So we certainly have to go beyond that. So, otherwise we'll only pay attention to ourselves.
So one thing which I think is fascinating, and this is what gives me hope that we will reach the answer eventually, is that what you touched on, the idea that you can't make it immediately obvious to somebody, is exactly the thing. Nietzsche, back when the whole "God is dead" quote, that's what he was talking about, right? The idea that, like, once upon a time we had this religious system which made it immediately clear to everyone, like the idea of that this would be against whatever God you want. Like, that was that immediate standard by which you could have someone go, oh shit, well, I'm wrong. And at the point where no one believes in not that no one, but at the point where people wholesale don't believe on that, it allows people to spiral down to these existential crises of, well, how do I know that anything's real or significant? And that's the problem, right? It's the fundamental problem you identified. How on earth are we going to make this work, right? Like, how do we make it so undeniably clear to people that there is something right, that there is something right or wrong, that some action is right or wrong? And I also, like, I'm on the fence about the whole atheism thing. I don't know if having an overarching religious system is the right way to go, but hopefully we can have some sort of secular, form of morality where it's immediately obvious to everyone. For now, I think the best way is just is to use the low-hanging fruit argument, right? Be like, here are some things we all agree are immoral, like, or even just to keep on just poking someone. You just keep on poking them, and they're gonna move. Like, you moved and you're getting annoyed at me because you know that this is the wrong thing to do, right? This is stupid and pointless, and all it's doing is causing you pain. And if you can accept the low-level version of right and wrong, then that naturally means that there must be some larger level, even if it's harder to articulate the answers. I think that's probably a good way forward, of using the pain, as you said, of kind of explaining it to people. And that's a bloody hard question, right? That's a hard thing to do. But there are lots of hard scientific questions and lots of hard maths questions. That doesn't mean that there's not an objectively correct answer at the end of it. So yeah, that's right. That's where I'd wrap up.
Yeah. I would essentially say, with morality, there are most claims I can think of seem to be generally easy to kind of come to agree with. Most people are kind of just nip and butt real quick. Okay, this is obviously wrong because this, or because this effect. There are, of course, few things that are going to be tougher, especially, think about maybe abortion.
Yeah.
People are going to argue because there's two different people and their lives involved, what's affecting what, and things like that. And that's one thing I kind of like the idea like that, rather than, like you're saying, with religion. If we had just a rigid book we looked at and said, here are the answers, we wouldn't think about it or care about it. And we certainly wouldn't grow or learn more about it. So not having that, at least will help give us more of a desire to understand why we think these things, or stuff like that. And I've almost, that's one of my main reasons I looked into objective morality recently, is because there's a lot of debates I've been seeing. Actually, I don't know why they've been around forever, but a lot of debates focus specifically on, can you have morality or objective morality without God? I've been watching some of those lately, and so my question was, I wasn't really sure. I was kind of questioning if some atheists were trying to kind of create an objective reality as a way to battle against that religious claim. That's kind of when I really started looking into this. I wanted to understand it.
I've got a debate coming up about that, actually.
yeah, I've seen that. I'm on your side, I believe, on that. So I don't think.
So I think it's just one of those things where it depends what you mean by God. So I don't think, for example, that there's literally like a big giant man in the sky, which and you need that. But I think that on a different level, what other people mean by religion is not that there is literally a figure out there, but that there is, if you were to collate all of those stories I was talking about earlier of what makes someone moral, and then you were to combine all of those archetypes into one divine figure, right, who embodies all of the things we've discovered, and you call that God, then that I can get behind with. I can get behind. But that's constructed. Not to use constructed as pejorative. We construct lots of great things, So I think it really depends on what people mean by God, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So if you want to say that you can't have a morality without some idea of what the ultimate moral figure is, then I could probably agree with that, right? Because that's just kind of like saying you can't have morality without a correct answer. Obviously, you need a correct answer, and you need some vision of what that looks like. If the claim is you can't have morality without like a literal man in the sky, that's a problem. And I don't agree with that. But I think that's one of those things where the language of religion has become increasingly murky as time has moved on. So yeah, I'm sure we can find some common ground there. But obviously, we're hitting on the same important question.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got about 30 seconds left. I'm just going to wrap it up.
Yep, go for it. Thanks.
I think we had a good discussion. Yeah, I appreciate it. Hopefully, we'll talk again sometime soon. But I think I learned a lot from you, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm sure other people can maybe learn a little bit or enjoy themselves by watching.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks very much. I'll see you next time.
All right, take care.